Okay, everybody, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Christian Pais. I'm an assistant professor in ethnic studies. I'm also the person organizing the Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration Colloquium. I'll say a little bit about the colloquium and about our speaker today, but at the moment, I just want to say that we're super excited that you're with us today for this conversation. They're sharing your lunch, despite the very, very, very hectic schedules that everybody has. So our lecture today will be recorded, or it's being recorded right now, and it will be uploaded on our website. So for the colloquium, it invites speakers from Berkeley campus and other institutions to share their research on various aspects of race, ethnicity, and immigration. It's pretty much in the title. One important theme in our colloquium is to explore the changing shape of ethnic politics in our country, and specifically the impact of immigration on the country and in California's political and economic life. This colloquium is supported by the Institute of Governmental Studies at Berkeley. If you have any questions, or if you want to learn more, you can search for both the Institute of Governmental Studies at Berkeley. We'll be putting it on our chat box, or the REI Colloquium website. So the colloquia are open to all members of the campus community, but also outside of campus. And so many of our folks who are participating today are comrades outside of the Berkeley campus. So it is my great, fantastic pleasure to introduce the speaker for today. This is our fourth speaker for this academic year. Our speaker is Professor Mei Nai. Dr. Nai is the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies, a professor of history, and the co-director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. She is the author of Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, and The Chinese Question, the Gold Rush and Global Politics. This talk is also co-sponsored by the Center of Race and Gender. And I should just say that Professor Nai's work has been foundational for mine, especially her first book. I am excited about the talk today, a global perspective on anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment in the globe. So with that, Professor Nai, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pais. And thank you to the Colloquium on Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here with you today. Just about 1 year ago, on March 16th, 2021, 8 people in Atlanta, Georgia, including 6 Korean and Chinese women, Soon Chung Park, Hyun Jung Grant, Sun Cha Kim, Young Ai-yu, Xiao Jie-tan, and Dao Yo-feng were murdered. The Atlanta killings took place after a year of pandemic-related harassment and assaults against Asian Americans, and that violence has not relented. In New York City, where I live, in just the last couple months, 4 Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, 3 of them women, have been killed. Michelle Go died when she was pushed onto the subway tracks before an oncoming train. Christina Yuna Lee was followed to her apartment in Chinatown and stabbed to death. Yao Pan Ma died months after being stomped while collecting cans. And Gui Ying Ma succumbed to brain injuries she sustained last November when she was struck in the head with a large rock while she was sweeping her sidewalk in Queens. Just last week, a white man went on a 2-hour-long rampage through Midtown and downtown Manhattan, randomly attacking 7 Asian American women, punching them in the face, and sending some to the hospital. Many people attribute these attacks to the racism fanned by Donald Trump, who blamed China and Chinese people for the coronavirus. That may be the proximate cause, although at this point, virus mongering seems to be decreasing as we proceed now into the second year of the pandemic. The ongoing violence against Asian Americans seems to suggest a deeper and more generalized racism, one that has lurked just beneath the surface and has now been unleashed to terrorize us, especially those of us who are Asian women. Today, I want to offer a historical analysis of the origins of that racism and its reproduction, beginning in the Gold Rush era, which is the subject of my new book, The Chinese Question. In the book, I track the origins of racism and exclusion politics in California, Australia, and South Africa, in their different local iterations, and how local politics traveled and evolved into a global race theory and a common exclusion policy in the Anglo-American settler colonies. The justification for the exclusion laws was that the Chinese were an unassimilable race and therefore could never be full or proper members of nations that consider themselves white man's countries. Exclusion extended to all Asians and remained in the law until the middle and late 20th century, in the US until 1952, Australia until the 1970s, and South Africa until the 1980s. To illustrate the depth and persistence of exclusion's logics, let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that if there had been no exclusion laws and Chinese and other Asians had continued to freely immigrate to the United States, California, and the West. Indeed, the whole country would look radically different today. Not all of Asia's so-called teeming masses would have inundated the United States. Migration doesn't work that way. The poorest do not migrate because they can't afford to, and the wealthiest don't need to. Migration sets patterns or chains from certain areas and not others. Still, by 1950, there would have been many millions of Asian Americans building their lives in this country and in the process contributing to the United States. Instead, in that year, 1950, there were a mere 320,000 Asian Americans, comprising just 0.2% of the US population. Since the immigration reforms of 1965, the number of Asian Americans has increased tremendously, but we are still barely 6% of the US population, less than 6%. Yet too many Americans believe still that there are too many Asians in the United States and that we don't belong here. So let me talk about the historical origins of these ideas. Chinese people first came to the United States in large numbers during the California Gold Rush of 1848 and 49, which crowned the continental expansion of the United States. Under the sign of manifest destiny, the idea that the West was God's gift to white Protestant Americans, the United States had gone to war with Mexico and annexed its northern half, including California. Westward expansion absorbed the sectional conflict over slavery and brought the genocide of indigenous peoples across the Great Plains and the West. Manifest destiny continued to define the dominant vision of the United States for at least a century. When Euro-American settlers arrived at the edge of the continent, they celebrated their conquest of the West and their closing of the frontier. And from there, they looked out across the Pacific Ocean, the next frontier, with both excitement at the prospect of new conquests and anxiety over the new peoples that might come. The gold rush is often celebrated for the individual daring, ingenuity, and male camaraderie of the 49ers, engaged in a bold experiment in democratic self-government. Less well remembered, but no less true, is that it was also violent and racist. Gold seekers and the fledgling state government of California pursued the extermination of indigenous peoples. White native-born Americans agitated against foreign miners, weaponizing manifest destiny for competitive gain and driving many Europeans, Australians, Latin Americans, Mexicans, and Chinese from the diggings. But hostility against Chinese took a special cast in 1852. Governor John Bigler, facing a tight race for re-election, made an incendiary speech before the state legislature in January of 1852, claiming that the Chinese, a race of heathens and slaves, were invading the state and threatening the society of free producers. Leaflets printed by Bigler and newspaper accounts circulated copies of the speech around the state. Many miners were already anxious because the easy gold in the rivers was being depleted and deep-pocketed capitalists were taking over the industry, replacing independent prospecting with wage labor in underground quartz mines. Bigler's bigotry found a receptive audience. White miners passed resolutions to keep Chinese people out of their districts and provided the votes Bigler needed to win a second term. He operated from the classic nativist playbook: tap into popular grievance, offer a theory of blame that blames an outside group, and weaponized resentment for partisan gain. The Chinese people who went to California were voluntary immigrants and independent prospectors, not indentured workers. But Bigler claimed that, quote, coolies are being sent here under contract at merely nominal wages, and their families are being retained as hostages for the faithful performance of their contracts. He argued these were not bona fide contracts, but were rooted in so-called moral turpitude and coercion. And in doing so, he invoked two contemporary anxieties. One was the use, mainly by the British, of Indian indentured labor in the Caribbean plantation colonies after the abolition of slavery. The other was the more proximate example of slavery in the American South. These two associations, colonialism and slavery, inspired the racist theories against Chinese immigrants and have haunted Chinese Americans and Asian Americans ever since. Two Chinese American merchants and leaders in San Francisco, Tong K-Achik and Habwa, wrote a letter to Bigler refuting his claims. They explained that the Chinese in California included laborers, tradespeople, mechanics, gentry, and teachers. Quote, none are coolies if by that word you mean bound men or contract slaves. They added, in the important matters we are good men. We honor our parents, we take care of our children, we are industrious and peaceable, we trade much, we are trusted for small and large sums, we pay our debts and we are honest, and of course, we tell the truth, unquote. Finally, the merchant leaders asserted that there was a positive relationship between migration and trade, that they were mutually supporting elements of foreign contact and exchange. They wrote, if you want to check immigration from Asia, you will have to do it by checking Asiatic commerce. A resurgence of racism against the Chinese engulfed San Francisco in the 1870s, including mob violence, arson, and discriminatory local laws. This hatred emerged after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which brought unforeseen consequences to the West. California's new connection to the East Coast encouraged domestic migration and the importation of cheap manufactured goods, resulting in falling wages and unemployment. Integration into the national market brought the long tail of the recession from the East. The coolie trope was remarkably adaptive to new conditions. The philosopher Henry George gave it theoretical heft, using the Chinese question to test his emerging views about labor and monopoly. He argued that unlike European immigrants whose wages eventually rose to the level of native-born workers, Chinese immigrants were a permanent source of cheap labor because they were unassimilable coolies. George imagined a class struggle between workers and capitalists, but he put the Chinese in the camp of the bosses. Anti-coolieism also targeted Chinese women. There weren't many Chinese immigrant women in California, but some were wives of merchants and laborers. Wives of fishermen worked alongside their husbands as partners, while other women were servants for wealthy Chinese families, or sex workers who offered their services to both Chinese and white men. But the anti-Chinese movement stereotyped all Chinese women as prostitutes, dubbing them as slave girls, female counterparts of the male coolie laborers. These attacks portrayed them as diseased and immoral, but that rhetoric was also laced with exoticism and desire. San Francisco's most famous Chinese madam, A Toy, was said to be so beautiful that men paid an ounce of gold just to look at her. The Page Act of 1875, the first Chinese exclusion law in the United States, barred so-called Mongolian prostitutes from entering the country. The law required all women to be interrogated upon entry to prove they were not a prostitute. Unsurprisingly, Chinese female immigration plummeted. That satisfied the real motive behind the Page Act, the prevention of Chinese population growth through natural reproduction. The legislation left a legacy of separated families and helped establish the enduring stereotype of Oriental women as dangerous and desirable. The Page Act also barred foreign contract laborers, but it could not keep out Chinese men because they were not, in fact, indentured. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 took care of that, barring Chinese laborers from entering the United States and all Chinese immigrants from naturalized citizenship. The exclusion laws codified the idea that the Chinese were racially unassimilable. They could never be anything but a coolie race, controlled by despotic masters without individuality or will, in no way independent in thought or action. The Supreme Court layered another theory onto coolieism, that Chinese exclusion was necessary for national security. In the famous Che Chan-ping case in 1889, the court wrote, quote, "To preserve its independence and give security against foreign aggression and encroachment, it is the highest duty of every nation. If therefore the government of the United States considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country who will not assimilate with us to be dangerous to its peace and security, their exclusion is not to be stayed because at the time there are no actual hostilities with the nation of which the foreigners are subject. The existence of war would render the necessity of the proceeding only more obvious and pressing." Previously, federal regulation of immigration had been justified under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. In upholding Chinese exclusion, the court invoked national security to justify racist legislation. The legislation prompted a fresh round of violence, arguably worse than what had come before. It was as though exclusion gave license to whites to act upon the idea that Chinese were unwelcome. In 1885 alone, a white mob violently expelled the entire Chinese population of Tacoma, Washington, and white workers and townspeople massacred 128 Chinese coal miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming. The Chinese exclusion laws were subsequently extended to the people of the Philippines, India, and Japan. Indeed, an entire barred Asiatic zone was established in 1917, lumping different national origin groups into a single racial category, the so-called Asiatic. Modern colonialism and global trade meant a greater integration of the global economy, and with it, mass migration, sparking struggles over race and immigration throughout the Anglophone world. As Tang and Abua, the Chinese merchants, had pointed out in 1852, trade begets migration and vice versa. Thus, American policy makers constructed an open door to China that would swing only one way, allowing American products, missionaries, and capital to enter China while keeping Chinese people out of the United States. For all its talk about the equality of nations and the open door, the American approach was typically colonial, treating China as an object of commercial and missionary desire, but Chinese people as degraded and backward and unwelcome and undesirable as immigrants. The settler colonies of the British Empire followed the example of the United States. Canada mimicked America's exclusion law. Australia adopted an unapologetic white Australia policy in 1901. South Africa took inspiration from Jim Crow in the United States and from white Australia. In the early 20th century, American and British races were publishing screeds like The Passing of the Great Race, The Asiatic Danger in the Colonies, The Rising Tide of Color, to promote the idea that the temperate zones of the world should be reserved for the white race. But not only white supremacists connected domestic and foreign policies. Anti-racists and anti-imperialists also found common cause and solidarity across the global color lines. The anti-slavery book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a bestseller in China in 1901. It was the first American novel to be translated into Chinese. A book reviewer in Shanghai wrote, "The book is not really about the suffering of the Black race as it is about all races under the whites. The novel is a wake-up call to rouse us from a deep dream." Racisms, while originating in specific contexts, must be continually reproduced according to changing social and political contexts in order to remain potent. Because the exclusion laws could not eliminate all Chinese from the United States, the Western states erected a legal edifice to ensure their subordination and marginalization. Racist laws forbade Asians from marrying white people, from attending white schools, from testifying in court against whites, from owning agricultural property, and from holding commercial and professional licenses. Restrictive covenants barred the sale of real estate to Negroes, Jews, and Orientals. Exclusion underwrote the popular understanding that Asian Americans born in the United States were not true citizens despite their birthright. The presumption of foreign loyalties most famously led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II on grounds that they were a so-called enemy race. Most of these racist laws against Asians remained in force until the late 1940s, when Black civil rights activism defeated similar restrictions on Asian Americans. The Asiatic exclusion laws themselves fell from 1943 to 1952, the result of wartime foreign policy imperatives. When Congress repealed the laws, however, it imposed minuscule quotas on the Asian countries. Nevertheless, immigration opened a bit, and Asian Americans made small steps in socioeconomic and residential mobility, gaining access to professions and the suburbs. During the Cold War, an ideological space emerged in which Asian Americans could declare themselves as opposed to communism in East Asia as a way to assert their loyalty to the United States. They also cannily promoted stereotyped cultural qualities, that Asians are quiet, good workers, good students, and respectful of their parents, to advocate for their social inclusion. Journalists and sociologists weaponized these ideas to discipline Black and Latino peoples, and some Asian Americans believed they were better too. Through these contexts, a complex dynamic, as historian Ellen Wu has argued, Asian Americans' place on the racial landscape went from being definitively not white to definitively not Black. But the repeal of the exclusion laws, incremental socioeconomic mobility, and even the establishment of equal quotas in the 1965 immigration law were insufficient to eradicate racism against Asian Americans. That is in part because of the weight of history, but it's also because racism found ample grounds for reproduction in the conduct of American colonialism and wars in the Asia-Pacific region, going back to the Opium Wars and gunboat diplomacy in the 19th century, straight through the conflicts of the 20th. Although all wars dehumanize the enemy, the dehumanization of Asians is distinctive in its racial idiom and its persistence across time. It centers around ideas that, for example, for Asians, life is cheap, and that as uncivilized peoples, they do not engage in civilized warfare and therefore must be fought with like means. During the Philippine-American War, which ran from 1899 to 1902, the United States invented waterboarding to torture Filipino guerrilla fighters. The US Army also burned villages and rounded up civilians into strategic hamlets, a practice it would use later in Vietnam. The United States dropped atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, napalm and Agent Orange on Vietnam. In truth, it was the United States military that considered Asian life cheap and engaged in barbaric warfare against Asian peoples. The prostitution of Asian women for American servicemen abroad is an enduring feature of the US military experience in the Asia Pacific. Sex markets have ringed US Army and Navy bases, whether during wartime or Cold War occupation in Vietnam, Korea, the Philippines, Okinawa, and Guam. The history of military prostitution generated racist and misogynist stereotypes in which Asian women are portrayed as exotic, subservient, always available. These cultural attitudes and stereotypes about Asian women don't end when the soldier returns home. They become incorporated into American culture. And finally, to the hot and cold wars, we must add the trade wars. In the 1980s, the introduction of Japanese electronics and automobiles into the American market sparked a racially tinged protectionist movement. And in our own time, Americans' anxiety about China's rise as a global economic power has fueled a new round of yellow peril racism. The figure of the coolie has returned, embodied today in factory assembly workers in China's special economic zones and Chinese international and Chinese American university students in the United States. They are all imagined to toil under slave-like conditions ruled by the Communist Party or by tiger moms. Their extreme labor posing unfair competition to white American workers and students. The stereotype of the high-achieving model minority, aside from obscuring major differences in status among different Asian groups, is a pathology, not a compliment. The late Afro-British cultural theorist Stuart Hall famously wrote that we have to understand not racism in general, but racisms. According to Hall, racism might be everywhere a, quote, deeply anti-human and anti-social practice, but it is not everywhere the same. Specific histories, contexts, and environments produce particular racisms, he said. And Hall understood too that there's no such thing as race as a biological, in a biological sense. Rather, racism is a way of thinking about social groups according to differences that are presumed to be natural and immutable. Racism is more than a series of stereotypes. Racism is ideological, a way of looking at the world that justifies and explains material structures of inequality and frames, if not determines, the life chances of racialized groups. Racism is political. It is mobilized and weaponized to create support for the policies of certain interests that benefit from inequality. For Asian Americans, the policy of exclusion looms as large as Jim Crow does for Black people. This association is more than a metaphor. In the late 19th century, Jim Crow and Chinese exclusion were related projects of white supremacy, one in the South and one in the West. After the Civil War, the old planter class and the new industrialists in the South responded to the prospect of equality for the formerly enslaved peoples by relegating them to second-class status, stripped of the franchise and other civil rights. The dangers that white supremacists associated with Black citizenship provided an object lesson for why they believed Chinese people should be excluded. A reactionary alliance between the West and the South pushed the exclusion laws through Congress. Asiatic exclusion and Jim Crow segregation were two modes of racial management necessary for white supremacy after the Civil War, when the West and the South were being integrated into a national economy based on corporate capital and a polity made up of white male voters. These policies relied on euphemism and legal fictions like aliens ineligible to citizenship or separate but equal to work around the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection and due process for all. Indeed, in the late 19th century, the Supreme Court would interpret the 14th Amendment to favor increasingly the rights of capital, not those of the formerly enslaved people or Asian immigrants. Laws like these were not preordained, but resulted from a choice made between two competing visions. The nation can be built on the principle of white supremacy or on that of democracy. Frederick Douglass understood that the futures of the South and the West were entwined, and that together they would determine the fate of the nation as a whole. He said in 1869, speaking out against Chinese exclusion, quote, "I want a home here not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here for both his sake and for ours." Americans are still struggling over competing ideas of what this nation should be. Sadly, that debate still includes whether Asians belong and whether racism against them even exists. Although the white supremacist vision of manifest destiny today continues to animate some segments of the American population, we still have a choice. Frederick Douglass's democratic vision offers us a path towards a more inclusive future should we decide to stand in solidarity against all racisms. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Nye. This wonderful talk. We're going to open it up to questions. People can add their questions. I think Ezra, where they can they put the questions in the chat box, or will they have like a separate?
I think there's a Q&A at the bottom.
Yeah, okay, perfect. There's a Q&A. There we go. But in the meantime, can we, I'm wondering, Professor Nye, if you can tell us a little bit about the process of how did you begin your latest book, The Chinese Question? What was that process like? I mean, you're looking at so many different regions, and it provides a wonderful view of the world and the circulation of these ideas. But I'm just wondering, how did you come to this idea? How did you move through archives? What was the process of writing it?
Well, I started with a kind of a personal experience as a teacher. I had a student who was writing a paper about 19th century politics in California. And he wrote that the Chinese were coolies. that they were indentured workers. And I knew that wasn't true, but I actually had a hard time showing him because the literature was full of the misinformed view that they were coolies. And so I realized that while there was some evidence to the contrary, it was kind of scattered, and that most of the history that had been written since the 1960s just repeated this idea over and over again using the same bad sources. So I started out by thinking, okay, I'm going to slay the coolie myth, and I'm going to have to find the sources in California and show empirically that they were not coolies, and also to analyze the politics that, you know, gave rise to and reproduced that idea. And then it kind of went out of control, and it became, you know, it just spun into a whole nother kind of project. I was at a conference in Australia in the old gold country in Victoria, and I noticed that the landscape, it looked to me like Napa Valley. And so I said, and I knew that there was gold mining there. So I said, there might, and there were Chinese there. So I said, well, this might be an interesting comparison. And then, I don't know, a year later, so I was at another conference in South Africa, and I learned about the Chinese who were recruited there as contract workers to work in the deep mines on the Witwatersrand. So I said, well, that'd be interesting to do a comparative study. So I had no idea what I would be comparing. I had no idea what I would find. I kind of went off to these different archives, and I'm very privileged that I have, you know, funding from my university and from grants that allowed me to do that. And so I ended up, you know, looking at a lot of different places, well, 3 major places. And I think the thing that really got me going was when I was in Australia, I expected to find the coolie myth, right? I expected to find the same politics. So what I found was first that the Chinese gold miners work in many of the similar ways, like their labor organization, their social organizations are very similar. But I did not see the coolie trope on the gold fields in Australia. And then I realized, well, you wouldn't have seen it there because there was no African slavery in Australia, you know, because it's a shorthand, right? It's in the United States, it was a shorthand to compare Chinese to slaves. But there were no slaves in Australia. The unfree in Australia were Irish and English convicts. So the coolie trope shows up in Australia 20 years later in a different context, in an urban working men's movement. So that's what really, I think, made me think harder about how racism is really produced locally and historically and politically. But then you also see, you know, how it travels, right? How it travels through circulation of books, newspapers, people, and then you see in the late 19th century a global theory that emerges.
I'm still learning how to unmute myself. Thank you for that, Professor Nye. So there's a Q&A section that you can ask questions for Professor Nye. I know that we have a lot of undergraduate and graduate students, Professor, and many of them are interested in doing research in the 19th century. And I was wondering if you have any general advice, especially for, like, let's say upper division undergraduate students, and if they're interested in doing more research on mid to late 19th century California politics, given that they have the archives here at Berkeley. Would you have any advice for them?
In California, it's not easy to research the Chinese in the gold rush era, or in the railroad era, or even in the cities. It's not that easy because the sources are very scattered. And so, like in Australia, for example, the colonial government had a very heavy hand in all business. And so they kept very good records, and you can go to the archives in Australia and see all the claims, the claims registers. In California, there's only a handful of claim registers that are extant, and they're not in one place, right? And I don't think there's any at Berkeley. You know, there's some in Sacramento, There's some at the Huntington, they're just all over the place. So in California, you have to go through a lot of haystacks to collect your little needles. And so it's difficult, especially if you want to research Chinese in the 19th century outside of the cities, right? Now, the other thing I will say to undergraduates is that when you read something in an archive, you read a diary or letters or payroll, it doesn't tell you anything on its own. You have to engage with your sources. You just look at a payroll sheet. It's just a bunch of numbers, right? So you have to know a little bit before you even look at it, so you can think about what you're looking at. And then you have to really think about it. And that doesn't happen quickly, right? So you have to be patient. One thing I did spend a lot of time in the Bancroft, and I wrote one of the chapters I wrote was about a Chinese gold miner, a kind of former gold miner. This was in the 1880s, who was tried for murder. He was tried for murdering another Chinese man in Downeyville in Sierra County. And so as I followed the case, and I had read about it somewhere, and I tracked down the transcripts, which are in, the California State Archives. So I got those. And then the surprise in the case was that he actually ends up getting pardoned. And the archive has all these letters from white people saying they believed he was unjustly convicted. So that was interesting. And then I thought, well, how common was this for a Chinese convicted felon to be pardoned? So I spent a week in the Bancroft looking at all the annual reports of the state legislature, which contain the governor's list of pardons. Right, when the governor they make pardons at the end of the year or at the end of their term, or they're also people who are they're not pardoned, but they're released kind of like on parole, right? It wasn't called parole, but it was like that. So I looked up for 20 years every Chinese who had been let out of jail early. That's just hard work. That's just sitting there looking at the books, taking notes, and a lot of I don't know the number offhand, but it's in my book. But there were dozens of Chinese that were let out of jail before they finished their sentences. So there's this saying, a Chinaman's chance, which is that a Chinaman cannot get a fair trial, and that was generally true. But then I found this interesting information, right? So then I could say, well, why were they pardoned? What were the reasons, right? Some of it was because they were had spent many years in jail and they were very old and they were sick. So there was a kind of humanitarian reason. Some of it was because they were convicted based on what later is revealed to be perjured testimony. And so the judge gets letters from people saying, well, that isn't really what happened, and so it's really interesting. So you have to kind of ask the question. So I found out like one guy who was pardoned. I said, well, how common is that? Well, let's go find out. So you spend a week reading these reports. So that's why it took me, over 10 years to do the research for this book, because I went digging through a lot of haystacks. But to me, that's the fun part of being a historian. That's the fun part, is going through those haystacks and then thinking about it.
I asked my students how long they thought that I took for historians to write a book. They said 2 years. They thought it took 2 years. I told them at least a decade. I think you already answered this, but I want to ask it. As one of my students, he asked, this is Angel Ramos, where do you look for sources? And you've already mentioned the various archives, and how do you classify them as good? And in part, it seems like it's the engagement with the text or the sources, and that you develop a relationship to them. But do you have any kind of classification system when you're looking at sources, or how does, yeah, so that's.
Well, okay, so what's a good source? Well, I don't know if you're referring to what I said earlier, that my student had used something that was based on bad sources. Is that what you're referring to? So what I meant by bad
Yeah.
sources was not so much that the source was bad, but that the historian was unethical in how he used those sources. So, for example, so specifically, the California State Senate and the US House held hearings on the Chinese question in 1876 and 1877, 76 and 77. And those hearings are all published, thousands of pages. And it's interesting to read them because you have all different kinds of points of view. So a historian named Gunther Barth, who was actually taught at Berkeley for many years, wrote a book in the 1960s called Bitter Strength. And it was about how the Chinese were coolies. And so what did he have as evidence? He quoted from those hearings, but he cherry picked the quotes that he wanted that backed up his view, and he ignored all the other points of view. Now, that in itself is interesting, right? That there's many different points of view, but he only cited the ones that he liked. And that is the biggest mistake a historian can make. If you see something in the archive that contradicts your thesis, you have to rethink your thesis, not throw out those evidence, right? So, and this is the really bad part. So he was bad, but other people were bad too, because then most of the things that were written after that book cite the same sources, the same quotes. I mean, there's thousands of pages. So why is it the quotes of 3 or 4 people show up over and over again? I don't even think they went back and read the original. They just took it from him and acted like they found those sources. So you have this kind of piling up of bad footnotes, right? You're laughing, Professor, but
I am laughing at the cynicism of the whole thing, right? I mean, there's an obvious unethical behavior of misrepresenting the material in order to sustain an argument that is not sustainable.
Right.
But then there are other people who are doing the same thing, and it's almost almost a collusion quality of bad academia.
Right. So it's all very unethical. It's at best, it's lazy. The people who repeat it, the best you can say about them is that they're lazy or sloppy. But I call this an Orientalist blind spot, because they just accepted it as, well, yeah, of course they were coolies, and here's the evidence, right? So let me just repeat it. So it's not just bad methods, it's bad methods that are pursued because people already have an opinion. Right? So that's what I meant by not so much bad sources, but bad use of sources, right? Unethical use of sources. So I think one of the things I'm sure you will learn from your professor is when you go do research, you have to have some kind of hypothesis, right? You can't go in there like not having any opinions, but you have to be really open-minded, and you have to go where the sources tell you. So the more sources you look at, the better, because no one source tells you everything, right? So the more stuff you look at, the more of a broader view you have. And you have to really, really be conscious to not just look at those things that confirm your opinion. And if you find things in the archives that contradict your opinion, you have to account for it. Maybe you're still right. Maybe that's just like a minority view, but you can't just ignore it, right? You have to account for it. And so I think, anyway, so that's what I meant by, so almost any source is a good source if you treat it with respect and integrity, right?
Thank you for that, Professor Nye. There's a few questions, and let's see. So Brian Smith, we'll get to your question in a second. I want to show Avi Rosenzweig. I'm mispronouncing that, and I apologize, but they are showing us that there's a great photo exhibit right now at the California Historical Society in San Francisco, showing portrait studios of Chinatown that immigrants were using to get calling cards and portraits made to send back to their extended families. So if you're in San Francisco, any of the folks who are watching this live, or Professor and I, if you're ever in California, this might be something to take a look at. And before we get to Brian's question, I want to ask Professor Yvonne Padilla Rodriguez's question, a former student of Professor Nye. She has a little chat comment. She says, "Thank you so much for your provocative and powerful talk and discussing the newest book." She's curious about the transition between your different book projects. So what sorts of lessons did you learn, or what sorts of assumptions or preconceived notions did you overturn with every one of your projects, from impossible subjects to the lucky ones and now to the Chinese questions?
My books have all been somewhat different, but I think they follow certain basic interests. And I think what my general interest has been to push back against this idea of America is a land of inclusion, if I can just say it that way. And there's a kind of one variant of that view, which is actually very common, which is not so, it's a little more complicated, right? It goes like this. It's like, well, yes, there's been a lot of racism in our country. There's been exclusion laws, there's been violence, but over time we get better. And what America is really about is about dealing with its discriminations, and ultimately, eventually, we're an inclusive nation. And I think that's a very common view. And I think that whether or not, so there's a kind of assumption that that there's progress over time. And I think progress is something that is never preordained. It's never the end, necessarily the end point. It's possible, but it's also possible that we go backwards, or we go sideways, or we go into some place that's utterly new, and we don't understand, and we have to figure it out. So progress has a kind of inevitability to the concept. And I think that we have to, as historians, we understand that nothing is preordained, everything's contingent. Everything depends on what people do. And so part of I think what I've always tried to show is that racism is not some, kind of general human condition, but it's something that's it's political. And if we understand that it's political, we can also think about how we can be political, right? To be anti-racist, right? So I think those are the, so when I wrote The Lucky Ones, I mean, I got involved in that because it was just a really interesting story about a family. But what that family revealed to me is that our Chinese American history is not like exclusion, then inclusion, right? First it was bad, then it got better. But that inclusion and exclusion happened at the same time, right? And they were intertwined, and they defined each other. So that's, that was kind of the underlying argument of that book. It wasn't just a story about a family, it was a story about a family that to me revealed something interesting about the pathways that Chinese Americans took.
Thank you for that, Professor Nye. I wanted to turn to Brian Smith's question. I think you can see it in the Q&A, but I'll read it. And, respond as you'd like. In your initial remarks, you mentioned a white man, quote, white man attacking Asian women, yet in many articles and photos of attacks on elderly Asians, there seems to be a large amount of Black on Asian attacks. Why was there no mention of that in your presentation?
Well, I didn't deliberately not mention it. I do think that in New York, it's on occasion, there have been Black perpetrators, but it's mostly been white, I believe. I know in California, in San Francisco, and in Oakland, a number of the assailants have been Black. And I, so first of all, I think I have, last year after the Atlanta murders, I was talking to some sociologists about, are there data? And I think nobody has precise data, but it appears that while there are Black and sometimes Latino assailants, it's mostly whites. It's mostly whites and it's mostly white men. Nevertheless, it's something that we need to talk about, right? And so I think it's complicated, but I think these are some of the factors that are involved. First, in New York in particular, some of the Black perpetrators have been either homeless or people who are formerly incarcerated people living in halfway houses. There was a famous incident of a man who stomped an Asian woman on the street in Midtown Manhattan. He lived a block away in a converted hotel that was a halfway house for formerly incarcerated people who had mental illness problems. The man who shoved Michelle Go in front of the subway, I don't know what nationality he was, but he was mentally ill. And so I think this is a real tragedy in this country where we treat people who have drug addictions or mental illness as disposable, right? And we don't have any services for them. We don't help them. And racism, I mean, people of color can be racist. There are Asians who are anti-Black. There are Blacks who are anti-Asian. I mean, these ideas exist in society, and people of all backgrounds are influenced by it. And I think the problem with mental illness and addiction in particular is that then you have people who don't control their ideas, they don't control themselves, and it becomes violent. And so, I think from what I hear from friends that I have in Oakland, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your opinions about this, is that it seems that it's as kind of opportunistic crime, right? It's like, oh, it's open season on Asians, now we can go mug them or something. And then there's also proximate issues in Oakland, like gentrification and displacement of poor African Americans from their homes as gentrification expands. And I don't know why Chinatown is considered a gentrification, because Chinatown's been in Oakland for a very long time, but I'm not familiar with all the specifics. So, I think there's a lot of things that influence people's behavior. It's local conditions, it's, race relations in general, it's, poor social services or lack of social services for people. I don't believe in, personally, I don't believe in charging people with hate crimes. I don't believe in just locking people up. I don't think that's the solution. I don't think that helps. It doesn't make me as an Asian woman feel safer if they're throwing Blacks or whites into jail. I think there has to be a really kind of different way of thinking about it. And I don't have the solution. But there's a division among Asian Americans in New York. There was an article in the Times about it, about how some people want more cops on the street, mm-hmm. and other people, including younger people, don't think that's the answer.
Thank you for that, Professor Nye. And Brian, if I can add a few comments, so one, the data is not there. My friends who are organizing in Oakland and in Chinatown have repeated what Professor Nye said. The numbers are showing more white assailants. I think it might be mindful for us to think about the ways in which, as Professor Nye noted, the history of anti-Asian discourses are rooted in white supremacy. There's no equivalent of Black supremacy in our society that would do this. And a lot of the organizers, at least in Oakland, have been leading a lot of Black and Asian solidarity activities, whether it be marches, walking at night in neighborhoods just to do collective safeguarding, in order to avoid both the invisibility of Asian victimhood in these instances, but also the hypervisibility of Black assailant narrative.
And as an alternative to heavy policing.
Exactly, and an alternative, exactly. That's very true. And it's, and so, yeah, so I know no one is trying to misrepresent the data points. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see. I don't see any other questions for right now. I have another question for Professor Knight, and we can, if no other questions, we can close this lecture soon. But your first book was incredibly important for immigration studies. So the Impossible Subjects, and one of the qualities that I appreciated from the very beginning when I started my PhD program was your attempt to think about immigration law and its impact on multiple racialized communities, both the fissures within those communities and between those communities. And that's in 2004. And now there's greater push for multiracial and interracial studies in order to attend to the specific dynamics of racism, but also to its global composition. And I'm wondering if you see trends that are encouraging for you in interracial or multiracial or just race studies in US history.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. It's a great point. But let me just say, I did not write Impossible Subjects as I didn't intend it to be like a multiracial survey. I wrote each chapter on a different aspect of immigration law that created irregular status. So guest workers, colonial subjects, wartime, Japanese during, wartime. So each chapter ended up being about a specific group, but it was really about how these groups were the focus for a particular kind of policy, right? So I wasn't writing about Mexican Americans in general. I was writing about guest workers in Bracero program, right? And I wasn't writing a kind of general survey about Japanese Americans. I was writing about the problem of citizenship in the camps, right? So anyway, but I think it does have that kind of quality, right, of looking at different groups. And I think you're right. I think more scholars are interested in doing comparative work or work that is I don't want to say intersectional, work that is kind of relational, perhaps. But I think, you have to decide, like, what is your theme? What's the thematic? And I think what's healthy about this is not only that we think about race in comparative and relational terms, but also that we think about it in the broader context of US history and, or, American history, hemispheric history or global history. And that's what I tried to do in my new book, The Chinese Question, is to think about Chinese exclusion as a feature of late 19th century globalization of capitalism. Nobody's really kind of offered that angle before, right? It's about people have understood exclusion to be a kind of racist impulse that's part of nation building, right? It's the other that gets created to as a foil for white identities, right? White identities in settler nations, right? But more than that, I try to show in my book, more than that, Chinese exclusion was also a new way of thinking about the world, a new way of thinking of imagining it, of governing it, of organizing it. And under the kind of big globalizing forces of the late 19th century, which had to do with trade, not least finance, right, which is based on gold. So I think that's, in that sense, I guess what I'm doing is also connecting to the field that we call the history of capitalism, although I don't really consider myself of a historian of capitalism, but I guess it is kind of a political economy, my book. So I engage with that field. So I think, the more we put the histories of different ethno-racial groups in the bigger context of nation building, but also larger trends of political economy, I think that we show that we're not, well, we always want to show that we're not marginal, right? But I think that's another approach to showing how these histories are really important to the bigger histories.
Thank you for that, Professor Nai. We have no more questions. This has been a fantastic conversation. I can continue talking to you, but I think we'll close our lecture, our guest lecture for REI at this point. I just want to push or encourage people to go out and get Professor Nai's book, The Chinese Question. It's published this past year, right? 2021?
Yeah, it came out in late August.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And we want to thank you, Professor Nai. For those of you who are on the participation, do the little clappy thing that takes place. Letty Volk just signed on from the Center for Race and Gender, sends us hugs. So
hi, Letty.
Professor Knight, this has been wonderful. We've had you're the fourth speaker this year for REI. We've been doing a lot of work with the Center for Race and Gender, and we're trying to essentially do this tethering together of localized histories in globalized contexts. We will have another speaker in late March, Professor Reina Ramirez, and she'll be speaking on her work and the work of Native Studies in California mission education efforts. So with that, Professor Nai, I want to thank you again for having spoken.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful talking with you and your students, and stay healthy and be safe, everybody.
Yeah, likewise. Take care.